Happy Monday, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Monday, September 22nd. I am joined coming out of the bye week by our senior producer at 11 Warriors, Chase Brown. Chase, how was your weekend, sir?
It was great, for as much as I love covering the Buckeyes, it was nice to kind of sit my butt down on the couch for a weekend and get to watch college football like I used to for so many years, growing up watching the sport and, getting the noon window, the 3:30, the 7:30, getting up just to make some food and grab some drinks. And yeah, it was an enjoyable experience. Lots of fun being able to watch college football.
Yeah, I had a good time too. We didn't get quite all the hate watching successful results that I think we would have wanted as Ohio State fans. Obviously, Nebraska continued to do Nebraska things in Lincoln. But we did have at least one result that I think went the way that Buckeye fans very much wanted to see, which we will get into momentarily. But before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at 11 Warriors and the sponsor of the 11 Dubcast this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. You can give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Now, Chase, I think most people would have been totally satisfied with the fact that Clemson, you know, took it on the chin, so to speak, against Georgia Tech now a week and a half ago, two weekends ago, if you will. So the fact that they had already started the season out 1-2, granted, one of those losses was to LSU. LSU looks like a very firm college football playoff contender, top of the SEC contender this season. No shame in that loss. Georgia Tech was a little bit rough, but that game I think had a narrower spread than a lot of people were expecting. It was roughly within a field goal, so it was closer than I think some people that weren't really paying attention maybe realized. Obviously, coming out of that game, the big what kind of made it a bigger deal than it otherwise would have been was the sensationalism around Dabo Swinney's post game press conference, in which he alluded to Clemson basically saying they can let me go if they're tired of winning, and then complaining about the fact that he's saying, why is our program held to a different standard when we have a down year, which is rich coming from a coach that has a $60 million buyout. And then they proceed to go up against Syracuse, and I'm not quite sure what the spread was on that game, but I have to imagine it was somewhere in the realm of the double digits. They were playing again at home. You're expecting them to get their first ACC win of the season, and they're taking it on the chin for most of the game. And there's a big weather delay that kind of lets them refocus themselves a little bit, but they still end up losing by a final score of, what was it? I want to say like 34-21. So the theme of today's show is going to be, as one empire falls, another one rises. And we'll get to the one that is, poised to fill the shoes of Clemson, so to speak, off of another stunning result this weekend in a minute. But I'm curious what your perspective is, having covered this team now for several seasons and witnessing or covering Ohio State for several seasons, while the beef with Clemson has still been fresh, even though these two teams haven't really gone toe to toe since that 2019 game in which Justin Fields dropped 6 touchdown passes on their head. The fall of Clemson seems imminent after this result and the full tilt that Dabo is on. So I'm just curious what your perspective on all of that is.
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say if anyone is watching on their screens right now and they saw a light rise up from below me, like I was telling an evil story, it's because my ring light fell. I caught it, put it back up. Don't know if I've ever had that happen before, but it did. So I just had to acknowledge it. That was not anything creative in my part. It was just something falling, and I put it back up. But I will say it. So you asked earlier what the spread was for the Clemson-Syracuse game. It was 17.5 for Clemson.
Yeah.
And not only does Clemson fail to cover that spread, they lose by 13 points at home. And that's a 30.5 point swing in Syracuse's favor. This is something that's I would never have guessed going into the season. I am someone that picked Clemson to make it all the way to the national championship game and to lose there. I think I picked them against Texas and have Texas beat them there. Both of those picks are looking pretty bad right now, I will acknowledge. But just I could not have guessed that Clemson, with all the talent that they had coming back, with Cade Klubnik, one of the most experienced quarterbacks in college football, coming back, that they would be 1-3 through 4 games. And I think there was some excitement around the Clemson program going into this season because they made the playoffs last year, and Dabo Swinney had made the decision that he was finally going to invest some in the transfer portal, and that they were going to build a roster that could contend for a national championship, something that Clemson did. They made to 4 national championship games in the 2010s, and they won 2 of those. And so I think people were like, okay, Clemson's going to return back to their prominence. Maybe they'll contend for a national championship again this year. And that is just not going to happen. And this is now for the 4th season in a row. We could 21, 22, 23, and 24. I guess it's the 5th season now here that Clemson has not lived up to its billing as a program that was a national title contender. And you can really make the claim, if you're an Ohio State fan, that that 2021 Sugar Bowl, where Justin Fields throws for 6 touchdowns and that deep ball to Chris Olave was the knife in Dabo Swinney's back that ends up sending this program into a spiral. Because since then, they're, I believe, 41-18, I want to say is the number total that they are since that game. And that is not what you would expect from a Clemson program that dominated most of the 2010s. So I think that it definitely is a dark time. I think Dabo Swinney even used that word, that it's a dark time and that he is really struggling to process what's happening within his program. And so definitely a lot of fun to be watching that if you're an Ohio State fan, knowing how much they took from you. In 20, I want to say it was 2013 that they ended up losing in the Orange Bowl. 2017, they got embarrassed in the playoff, 31-0. And then 2019, obviously, it's one of the greatest Ohio State teams that never won the national championship. And so it's pretty fun to dance on the grave if you're an Ohio State fan of what's going on in Clemson.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about Clemson's season going the way that it has relative to whatever your preseason expectations were, because you were hardly alone in that line of thinking
Yeah.
relative to what they were supposed to accomplish. I will say I did think that people were going a little strong on Klubnik. I thought people were just kind of right at giving him the benefit of the doubt as being probably one of the most experienced quarterbacks at a high level program coming back this year, that he was going to be, like a top 3 lock for the Heisman. And then we saw, in addition to Dabo's own bad post game comments coming out of last week's game, Dabo was a little bit more humbled out after this result, but it was actually Klubnik that stole the show in the post-game presser when he made allusions to the fact that he thought that Syracuse, anytime Clemson was trying to go up tempo, was very regularly faking injuries to get stoppages in the game. A lot of people said that was a very weak answer, that it kind of speaks to a little bit of fragility in terms of dealing with adversity. Not that I would have, anointed that upon him coming into this season, but I do think it's interesting relative to the high expectations that people had on this guy to compete for the Heisman, that this is where we're at now. I think that a lot of the extreme reaction that we've seen right now is more about the expectations that people had for this team rather than the fact that it's 1-3. Because all things considered, if Clemson is anywhere near still where they were supposed to be the rest of the way, they're probably still going to end up with a winning record, and they're not going to go to the college football playoff now or compete for an ACC title. But it's not like the boat has completely capsized for Clemson at this point. I don't know what it looks like for this program rebounding. I wouldn't say that they're all the way dead yet. They're certainly going to be looking at a down year relative to expectations, but I think that it's important too to consider that last season they were a very fortunate result in the ACC championship away from probably missing the college football playoff and not sneaking in. And them getting past the first round, I believe they won their first round game. Is that right?
They did. They did. They did.
Right. So I
I don't
think
know, actually. I'd have to check that real quick. I believe they ended up playing Texas in the next game.
right. So I think that that probably feeds into why the expectations were they what they were this season, and you just wonder if they didn't end up getting in that circuit, because there was that circumstance during deciding who were going to be the final 12 teams where a lot of people were hoping that SMU was going to get the benefit of the doubt over Clemson, and then they both ended up getting in. But had Clemson not had their break of fortune in the ACC championship, they probably don't end up getting in at all. And then if they're not in the playoff to make that late season impression, you wonder what the expectations are going into this season. And then if they're having similar success to what they're having right now, how different does the temperature and the mood around what has happened so far feel? So I think a lot of it is just not living up to preseason expectations, but it's important to consider who's setting those preseason expectations, which
Yeah.
kind of probably explains why Dabo felt the way that he did after that Georgia Tech result. Now, that's mostly me just, trying to be impartial. As an Ohio State fan, it's very, very funny, and I wish Clemson nothing but the worst, and I hope to continue seeing more of what we've seen thus far.
Yeah. Just to correct us real quick, they did lose the first round game
Okay.
to Texas at Texas, 38-24. But in that game, Cade Klubnik threw for 336 yards
Okay.
and had multiple touchdown passes. So I think that's also why people had started to say, okay, maybe he figured it out a little bit. They ended the season playing against number 15 South Carolina. They lost. They played number 8 SMU in the ACC championship game, and then lost to Texas in that playoff. And Klubnik threw for almost 300 yards in all of those games. So it is a little bit surprising, I think, to see him playing so poorly to start this season, and then them obviously losing games as a result.
There you go. On the opposite end of the spectrum, as I alluded to earlier, as one empire crumbles, another one rises. Man, that Illinois Indiana game. Indiana was I think like a 6.5 point favorite at home. And the interesting thing, when I previewed this weekend slate with Dan on the last episode of the Dubcast, I believe we both picked Illinois to win. And one of the reasons that I picked Illinois to win, and they were a very popular underdog, I think, from a lot of people this weekend, despite the spread. I think everybody but Pat McAfee on the college game day set picked Illinois to win, in fact, this weekend. But one of the reasons that I felt good about that was because I was seeing, we're still early in the season, but I was seeing a similar sort of untestedness from Indiana relative to their early season competition that I did when they came to play Ohio State last year. That was a big talking point going into their game with Ohio State, is yeah, they've looked great. Cignetti's had a wonderful opening act, but they haven't really played anybody of note yet. And now that they're getting this first big test and it's happening on the road in Columbus, how are they going to respond to it? It was a pretty competitive game early, but Ohio State ended up, I don't want to say running away with it, but they ended up controlling the game much more the longer it went on. And Will Howard obviously ended up extinguishing the cigarette at the end, or miming it
Yeah.
at least, which was a great moment. Brett Bielema did not get to do that on Saturday. This was a romp, the likes of which we've seldom seen. Indiana won 63-10 in a game they were favored by a little bit less than a touchdown to win. I mean, this was, frankly, I think the result itself not as surprising as Clemson losing to Syracuse. But if you told me that Illinois was going to lose this game by 53 points, by over 7 touchdowns, I would have had a harder time believing that than Syracuse beating Clemson outright this weekend. So in a lot of ways, this has a greater impression on me and my outlook for what the rest of the season and even the long-term future of college football looks like than what happened with Clemson this past weekend, just because this is still very much the infancy of the Cignetti era at Indiana. And a lot of times when you see good coaches come into situations where they galvanize and rebuild a program, it's still a pretty lengthy process. But in addition to that, it's usually at a program where there's at least been some modium of success prior to the coach coming in that they can use to kind of pick themselves back up and look back on with pride. Indiana didn't have any of that. And we're barely a year done with the first year of Cignetti, and he's already gotten them into the college football playoff where they prior to when Indiana played or prior to when Notre Dame played Ohio State in the national championship, I would say prior to when Notre Dame played Penn State, you could argue that Indiana played a closer game than any of the other games that Notre Dame ended up playing in the playoff to that point. I, I Indiana looked extremely impressive last year, and now after this result, there's suddenly I'm glad Ohio State doesn't have to see them in the regular season this year. I'll just put it that way.
Mhm.
Uh, I was a little bit nervous about how Illinois was going to go as one of Ohio State's big road tests in next month in October. Now, obviously, I'm a little bit quieted in that concern after this result, but relative to what I said about this being a bit more of a stunning development than what happened with Clemson, are you in a similar state of shock about just how impressive Indiana looks right now relative to where we're at in the rise of Cignetti in Bloomington?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I apologize. I'm looking off to my side. A little breaking news on the Dubcast. I don't know if this has ever happened, but Angelo Smith, Jeremiah Smith's younger brother, just committed to Ohio State. So I'm
Oh,
half doing this podcast, half making a graphic for us to put up on the website. But
oh
that's big
my.
news for Ohio State. It's equally as big for Indiana to continue dominating as much as they are. A joke that uh, I keep coming back to is like, Will Howard was very quick to kind of extinguish the cigarette, put out the cigarette, and saying, Google that, because Curt Cignetti obviously said in his introductory press conference, I win, Google me. But I got to tell you, man, this guy wins. Like, this guy is a winner. And it is very impressive that in back to back seasons, he could potentially bring the Indiana Hoosiers, to the college football playoff. And that is something that is not easy to do. Look at somebody as established and as well renowned as Luke Fickell, struggling as hard as he is at Wisconsin. And look at how many other coaches have made that big step from coming to the group of five to then getting this premier Power Five position and are unable to take the program to new heights. Curt Cignetti took James Madison and made it a perennial contender. It obviously was in a weird place where it was kind of making that transition between Division Two and Division One, so they weren't able to compete in the ways that they were maybe able to. Excuse me, it might have been the FCS to the FBS, but either way, it was they weren't able to compete at the level to which they deserved to compete. And so Curt Cignetti ends up taking a bunch of his guys from James Madison and goes and performs at Indiana in year one. And now here he is doing it again in year two. Fernando Mendoza, the quarterback he brought in from California, currently is the number one quarterback to pick, the number one player overall to pick in the Heisman odds at FanDuel Sportsbook. That's incredible. Indiana's quarterback is the Heisman frontrunner after 4 weeks. That is something I would never have imagined I would say, but here we are, and that's because Curt Cignetti can coach football, and it is something where they have Oregon and Penn State on the schedule, and that's about it. The rest of the way, those are the only two opponents I wouldn't feel comfortable picking Indiana to win in their matchup, but that would put them again where they were last year at 10-2 at the end of the season. They could potentially fight for a Big Ten championship spot. They could fight for a seed between 9 and 12 in the college football playoff again. And so it is an impressive job that Curt Cignetti is doing at Indiana, and it is one that I would never have imagined in a million years would work and he would have success that he is, but he's doing it. And it's just because he's a winner. He is absolutely a winner.
I could see him having success there when they I remember a lot of enthusiasm around the hire when it happened just because he was he had a very bold, strong attitude, which was atypical of a lot of the coaches that have been there in recent seasons or just in their entire history of their program really. So I could have seen them having success, but have this much success and to have it realized as quickly as they have is nothing short of impressive. It's been nice to witness their rise, and I do. They're not one of Ohio State's in conference rivals, so I can wish them nothing but the best outside of when they're playing Ohio State. But I do think at this point it would be surprising if we didn't see this team playing Ohio State in the Big Ten championship at the end of the regular season, given the fact that they won't end up seeing each other this year and the rest of the slate beyond. I think both of these teams end up playing Penn State, but if both of them can end up overcoming that, which I'm I'm more intimidated by Indiana based on what I saw this past weekend than anything I've seen out of Penn State in recent memory. So I have to imagine that if both teams have to overcome that obstacle on their way to meeting each other in the Big Ten championship, they'll be able to do it. But
Mm.
only time will tell. In closing, I do have to also acknowledge, obviously, one of Mr. Mendoza's best weapons on that team, Elijah Surratt, who has the best nickname in all of college football, obviously Waffle House, because the man is
Yeah.
always open. So I have to say, just on that merit alone, he is probably my favorite non-Buckeye in college football at the moment. So props to Mr. Surratt, who I believe is the active leader in touchdown catches at the FBS level at the moment, given that I think he's in his senior year or maybe fifth year or something. I think he went over 50 or 51 in this past game. So props to them. All best of luck to you, Indiana. It's been nice to see your rise. I'm sure Cignetti's probably eager to get it back on Ryan Day after what happened last year, but we'll see if these teams end up crossing paths in the Big Ten championship or perhaps even the college football playoff. But one game at a time. Right now, Ohio State's got to prepare for Washington this weekend. That will be their first big road test of the season. A game that opened with Ohio State close to favored by 2 touchdowns and has already seen a steady decrease in the spread down to, I think, just over 8.5 as of Sunday evening when we're recording this. So it'll be interesting to see how much more that takes shape over the course of the week. But we will be back on the 11 Dubcast to help get you ready for the game throughout this coming week in the mornings. Chase, thank you very much for joining me once again today, especially given the bit of breaking news that you had to share with us on the Dubcast tonight, even though this isn't going to post until 5 a.m. We appreciate you pulling double duty live as we're recording this to get the graphics spun up for Jeremiah Smith's little brother. But otherwise, thanks
It's
again
breaking news now, but it won't be breaking news when people
it's
watch it
breaking
at
news
5
from
a.m.
me.
It's breaking news to us. This
Yeah.
is our live reaction.
Right. So, but I appreciate your professionalism in grinding through that. But in any event, thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. Thanks to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, the official bank of 11 Warriors and the 11 Dubcast this Ohio State football season. We will be back to preview film study for this week with Kyle Jones tomorrow morning. Until then, please like, share, and subscribe to the 11 Warriors YouTube channel. We will see you then. Take care, folks.